Hello, everyone. This is Pelin Oğuz. I'd like to welcome you all to our program that we organized together with Medyascope as Istanbul Policy Center Sabancı Üniversite İşbirliğiyle Initiative. And as a part of this initiative, we usually mainly work on the issue of Turkey-EU relations, Turkey-European Union relations, as well as Turkey-Germany relations. So this is a big part of our work that we do at IPC. And we would like today to talk about Turkey-EU relations, the current status of the relations, and its future prospects and challenges. And also within the current global context, what are the effects of the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine on EU and also on Turkey-EU relations. So we will talk about all these issues with my guests today. Let me introduce my guests first. First of all, we have Andreas Nick with us today. Andreas Nick is currently our senior fellow, Mercator IPC senior fellow for May and June 2022. He has also served as vice president of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe before, and he has been a part of the head of the German delegation until January 2022. So thank you, Andreas, for being with us today. Okay, my second guest today is Senem Aydın-Düzgit, Professor Senem Aydın-Düzgit, and you know her well from our programs as well. She has been a big part of our IPC. She is a senior scholar at IPC as well as a research and academic affairs coordinator at IPC, and as well as a Sabancı University faculty member. Welcome, Senem Hocam. Okay, as you know, we have been covering all the issues and the Turkish foreign policy and the issues with Europe and what is happening between Turkey and Europe. And there has been up and downs throughout the relations, over the years. But currently, the situation within the global context is changing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And under this global context, maybe we can start with Andreas, and we can look at what would be his take on this transformative change with this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and maybe your evaluation and interpretation on this issue affecting how it will affect Europe and the Western Balkans. We can start with that, Andreas, if you wish.
Thank you very much for having me. It is indeed a challenging time in the global and European context. I think we look at the aggression, at the cruelty, at the victims in Ukraine every day with awe and shame. That is, I think, clearly the immediate concern that everyone has, how that can be stopped and overcome. But we have to also take into account that this is a dramatic change to the geopolitical environment that we have been used to live with over the last 30 years since the fall of the wall and the Charter of Paris in the OSCE. Yes, we had the unfortunate and tragic experience of the civil wars in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. But what we see today is for the first time on European soil full-scale aggression of one big European country against its immediate neighbor. And this is totally changing, I think, the security environment. I think also the environment of international cooperation in terms of the founding framework for the peace and security order on the continent. I think the consequences are quite difficult to assess as we speak. I want to illustrate the impact of that, which may be underestimated if you look at it from a Turkish perspective. Look at the map behind me, seeing that Turkey has been living with neighbors with military conflicts and aggression in Syria, in Iraq, in the Caucasus, in its immediate neighborhood for many years, and it's part of your neighborhood and your environment. For many, most Europeans, the situation that as it has evolved in Ukraine comes as a total shock that is basically turning over what we had believed was an almost guaranteed benign security environment in which people have lived for 30 years and in which a whole generation has grown up. And then we are now potentially back to something which will more resemble the Cold War environment, or even at least different or more challenging. That is a totally new situation to which everyone needs to adapt.
Thank you very much, Andreas Nick. Yes, actually, maybe it is quite early to tell many of the implications about the system change. But maybe we can continue with Senem Aydın-Düzgit on her take on this effects of war in terms of EU as a project, EU's integration, and EU's enlargement as a project.
Okay, thank you very much, Pelin. Now, of course, I do agree with Andreas Nick that indeed the security architecture in Europe is changing. We are, as of today, talking about NATO's expansion to Sweden and Finland, for instance. German defense spending is increasing to important extent. We have consecutive comprehensive sanctions packages adopted by the European Union. So here we see a rapid response and also a certain sense of solidarity that's being sustained. But of course, as you also rightly said, this is not just about NATO and security, but it's also about the political state of the European Union that is in question. And here, of course, an important concept that has been recently introduced by the French President Macron was Europe as a political community. He is basically arguing that we should now think about the way in which Europe can have certain leverage and influence in its wider neighborhood without necessarily opting for the full accession or enlargement perspective only. So the future of enlargement policy is at stake, whether something in between an enlargement, full membership, and a third country status, something, for instance, like an associated member status, which the European Parliament has been discussing recently, can be put in place. This is being discussed. And this, of course, is being discussed primarily with reference to the prospect of Ukrainian, Georgian, and Moldovan membership to the European Union, as these three countries are the ones that have applied for full membership to the EU after the Russia-Ukraine war broke out. So here, of course, this is this is, of course, primarily related to them and their application. But we know that this would have far-reaching consequences for the future of the EU's neighborhood policy and enlargement policy too. So in many ways, we're talking and discussing once again the different forms or prospects for differentiated integration in the European Union, whether the existing model of differentiated integration will remain the same or it will change. This is now up to debate, because the existing way of differentiation, as we call it in academic circles, external differentiation, often fails to introduce significant transformative leverage of the EU on third countries which are associated with the EU. So whether or not this can be a more, I would say, an inclusive process, a more substantive way of integrating these third countries into the EU single market and other policies, this is something that the EU will probably think about, discuss, and contemplate in the coming months or perhaps in the coming years. And then, of course, there is also the huge impact of this war on certain policies of the European Union. Many policies, of course, will be affected, but the ones that come to mind immediately are, of course, migration policy, since the temporary protection mechanism has been employed, operationalized for the first time in the EU towards the Ukrainian migrants. Energy issues, of course, energy policy. We're looking at the EU, which is even in a more desperate position to attain energy security, given the context of the war and Russian aggressiveness. And of course, climate change, since energy and fighting climate change, these are issues that are closely connected. And we know that the European Union has a very ambitious climate agenda that is to go completely carbon free by 2050. And it all remains to be seen how this might be accelerated or somehow be affected by this pressing need to reduce the dependence on Russian oil and gas. So I think I'll stop here for the first round.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe we can also ask Andreas Nick now, with his experience with the Council of Europe, because you were a part of the Council of Europe, and in terms of when you consider the relations between Turkey and Europe, of course, there are some relations that will unfold in the future that we are talking about, but Turkey-EU relations has mostly been as a transactional based and issue based, interest based issues, very important. But when we think about all these democratic backsliding in Turkey, human rights violations in Turkey, what do you think would be the role of Council of Europe in terms of relations between Turkey and Europe, considering the context?
I think Senem has highlighted some of the thematic issues that are being even further emphasized in the current context. Let me focus in my response on some of the institutional aspects. When we looking at the history of the European Union, it has always been the dualism of the two poles of intensification, of integration, and of enlargement. And I think over many stages we have found a very productive way of enhancing both of these slightly conflicting objectives in terms of a staged approach where a higher level of intensification of integration was achieved before the next round of enlargement could happen. I think this has to a certain extent come to a stop about 15 years ago after the major Eastern European enlargement, partly because the necessary adaptation of the internal governance structure of the European Union was failed in the referenda for the constitution. It operated under the Lisbon Treaty framework since then, which has worked reasonably well. I think in the Euro crisis, we had to do a lot more intergovernmental than on the integrated level of the European Union. But whether indeed the European Union at its current stage is ready for further enlargement is, I think, a critical question, and one that in particular President Macron has raised many times recently. And what we see with the development in Ukraine and this horrifying situation, I think the pressure increases for the EU in both dimensions. There is an increasing pressure with regard to project European perspective, to prospect stability, economic recovery into Central and Eastern Europe further. And at the same time, we are confronted with security challenges, with energy challenges, with migration challenges that have been named, which all demand, I think, for a higher level of integration and internal cooperation. So to balance those things is not easy. And in this context, I think the Macron proposal is a quite useful element to think this through, whether that could be a way to accommodate both requirements of urgency at the same time. So what does this mean for Turkey? And you mentioned the Council of Europe. Let me remind that the Council of Europe, comprising now after the Russian exclusion 46 countries, has always been a bit of the anteroom for the European Union, where in the preparation of the accession, especially issues like rule of law, human rights, and democratic institutions were promoted. I think this where the Council of Europe played a very effective role in the 1990s in the preparation of the accession. Turkey is de facto a founding member of the Council of Europe since the early 1950s, so has membership status here. What I see with concern, obviously you raised some of the issues, is that we should all work towards a point where these institutional links with Europe, with the Council, are not weakened. And we are all aware of the Kavala case, and so far the non-compliance of Turkey with the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, which, if that continues the way we observe at the moment, may put membership of Turkey in the Council of Europe at risk. We see a changed security environment in which I think the NATO membership of Turkey becomes even more important and more critical. So, first of all, I would say first priority, strengthen and solidify the existing institutional ties of Turkey with Europe and the European Union, membership in the Council of Europe, cooperation in NATO, and as a solid base to take the EU relations further. And what I understandably observe is clearly that with all the debates about a fast track for Ukraine, that there is a concern in Turkey of those who are keen to join the European Union, that once more I think they will jump in the line after the Central Eastern European countries in the 1990s and early 2000s, and now potentially with Ukraine and other countries. And I think that is, I know that is a sentiment that 10 years ago was very strong in Turkey, looking at some of the problems in the neighborhood, also in Central Eastern Europe, with countries like Romania or Bulgaria, that in the comparison, Turkey felt not necessarily fairly treated. The more important, I think, at this stage, to solidify existing ties through adherence to the rules and regulations of the Council of Europe and enhance security cooperation within our framework as NATO allies.
Following your thoughts on solidifying the existing ties, Senem Hocam, what is your take, and what do you think about the current status of Turkey-EU relations? Where were we before, and where are we now with the relations between Turkey and EU?
Okay, thank you, Pelin. Well, we haven't really had a very positive streak of relations in the last couple of years, one must say. We know that the accession process has been frozen, at least in effect, if not on paper. So, there are no new chapters opened, and we know that they cannot be closed due to a Council's 2006 decision. So the membership track seems to be frozen for the time being. Having said that, however, there is some cooperation on some policy areas. Of course, most notably, migration is the one that comes to mind due to the EU-Turkey migration deal, but also, of course, the customs union, however out of date it's claimed to be, is still in operation, and also, of course, close individual economic ties between EU member states, Germany, of course, being the most prominent one here, and Turkey. Now, of course, this kind of relationship where accession is no longer into the picture is increasingly shaping up to be a transactional form of relationship that is devoid of normative principles like democracy, rule of law, etc., which really defined much of the EU-Turkey relationship in the earlier periods. So, and the difficulty here, of course, is that we are seeing that sustaining a transactional relationship, sustaining it in a healthy and a working manner is, even that is very difficult if you have a lot of uncertainty, unpredictability, and erosion of freedoms and fundamental rights in one of the partner states, and that is the Turkish case that I'm referring to. So today we're not really looking at a very kind of a positive, a rosy EU-Turkey relationship, I'm afraid. The fundamental problems that have to do with that is really the sort of the increasing transactional nature, which has even been reduced to very minor sort of islands of policies or policy areas, and that do not really spill over to the others. Now, on the other hand, as you stated at the beginning, we now also have the Russia-Ukraine war, which is a new dynamic in the relationship. Now, since the war, we see that Turkey has been trying to strike a balance between Russia and the West here. And by the West, I mean, of course, primarily Europe and the United States. And it wants to stick to that balance because of its own economic relations and vulnerability vis-a-vis Russia, its reliance on energy towards Russia, and also, of course, geographic proximity to Russia and the sense of threat as well. So in some senses, since it is a NATO member, one can argue that this brought Turkey closer in some respects to the West as well. But having said that, what we're recently witnessing or seeing is that Turkey's problems, existing problems with EU member states, and also not just with EU member states, but also with the United States, are also tainting this cooperation or spilling over to issues that require cooperation in the context of the war. For instance, most recently, we see this in Turkey's ambivalent position regarding the membership of Sweden and Finland in NATO. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Now, another issue related to what Andreas Nick said and what I had said in the first round is, of course, these debates about, or these talks about, differentiated integration and a new form of political community or a new form of associate membership would work in practice. Now, I mean, and whether these could apply to Turkey. I mean, of course, it has to be said that Turkey already enjoys a certain degree of external differentiated integration with the EU, since, for instance, it has the customs union agreement, it has the migration deal, etc. It takes part in certain key EU agencies, etc., etc. So it already is integrated at some levels. But I think one of the problems that Turkey has had over the decades, and which could be a problem for other third countries also, is that this kind of external differentiation does not always work or can be subject to a lot of problems if the third country in question is not included in any way in actual decision making or in the making of the policies to which it's going to be subject to, etc. This is less of an issue when you're trying to externally differentiate integration with, let's say, a country like Norway, but more of a question when you're dealing with the integration of countries that are more problematic in terms of their proximity to EU rules and governance and standards, like Turkey, like Ukraine, like Moldova, etc. So this is an important issue. Then this is something that the EU would have to come up with. But of course, even though a third way, a successful way can be found, ultimately, for that to be used or for that to be a way of integrating Turkey closer with Europe, you would ultimately have to return back to democracy. And that seems to be the major stumbling block or the major issue that we should be discussing here.
Thank you very much. As Senem Aydın-Düzgit was referring to this, for this external type of differentiation to be successful, we need to have these countries to be a part of the decision-making processes. How would that be possible, Andreas Nick? Do you have any ideas about the third country involvement association for the European Union?
I think it is a particular complexity. I have never been a supporter of Brexit, but if Brexit had at least one potentially positive side effect, that it has maybe for the first time created a coherent framework of a close relationship with a non-member state in the immediate neighborhood. I'm not saying this is to be copied and pasted in each and every respect, but at least it has created an institutional framework that one could look at. Let me come back to Senem's remark on this bilateral transactional approach, which indeed has become a problem and a challenge, especially for us in Germany, as we have put probably more emphasis on our bilateral relationship with Germany than any other country in the European Union. But it is also important to acknowledge that Germany will not be able to pursue a purely bilateral transactional relationship outside the institutional framework of the European Union. And sometimes also we on the EU side are to blame that we create the impression that we only give appropriate attention to Turkey and its situation when Turkey appears to be a spoiler in a particular context, and that gets attention and that gets some concessions. But I think it's not necessarily a healthy and helpful pattern for the future. What I would recommend, even for small steps that we've been discussing now for a long time, from visa liberalization to modernization of the customs union, it would be extremely helpful if we could overcome some of the institutional obstacles that, for the time being, have blocked a lot of progress in that area. And one of that is clearly the Cyprus question. It is creating a situation where inside the EU we have veto players who will veto a lot of things unless we see progress on that development. And we should also work carefully that we don't create additional problems. I just spent the last few days on a Council of Europe meeting also talking about security in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I think any way to come to solutions also in the bilateral relationship between Greece and Turkey when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, but also in the multilateral framework in the wider region, would be extremely important context factors, I think, to make it much easier to facilitate that we can progress also on some of the more technical cooperation issues that are raised. But as you mentioned, decision making, I think one point that was on my agenda for more than 10 years is in terms of security cooperation. I think we used to have an institution called the Western European Union, where Turkey was a co-opted member. When that was folded into NATO and the EU structure, Turkey simply was no longer considered as part of the game. And something like co-opting Turkey in some of the frameworks of the common security and defense policy would be, I think, a wise approach, not necessarily in a way that would give Turkey a veto power, but a seat at the table in the conversation, even more so as Turkey is a NATO partner.
Yes, Turkey is a NATO partner as well as an important regional power, and it's still quite important for the European Union. And even though its accession process has been now frozen, the transactional relationship, the bilateral relations between Turkey and Germany, Turkey and Europe is continuing. But also I have a question, what would be the further challenges for EU-Turkey relations in the upcoming future, in the near future? What could be still the democratic backsliding is continuing in Turkey. The bilateral relations, we kind of have relations, but still they're not on the level that is what we are hoping for. So what could be the further challenges in the upcoming years for Turkey? Senem Aydın-Düzgit.
Okay, thank you. Wow, quite a few things, I would assume. But let me just perhaps also add, a few things to what we've discussed. I agree with Mr. Nick, Andreas Nick, and I'll also perhaps add on top of that regarding your question on, on this new forms of membership, etc. Now, of course, all of these things require treaty change, right? And we don't mention it because it's such a big taboo, or it has been such a big taboo for a long time now, right? Because since Lisbon, Europe has been going through crisis after crisis. So treaty change was something very much off the agenda. So now Macron has mentioned it. Now we wait, and the parliament is asking for it. So we'll have to see if this is going to happen. But at least it seems to be less of a taboo than, let's say, it was 2-3 years ago. Now, of course, and the difficulty with treaty change regarding these issues, of course, it touches upon two matters that are of key essential importance to member states and where they're generally wary of. One, of course, is the issue of money, that is the budget, right? So how much these countries will take, give, etc. So what's going to be the burden? And secondly, of course, institutions, right? So they generally are quite hesitant, or I'm assuming that they would be hesitant to give any voting rights or etc. to any third country that's not actually a full member. So this is an issue, right? So treaty change along these lines, I would say perhaps not impossible, but definitely something that's very difficult to do given the current context. Now, since Brexit has been mentioned, perhaps let me say a few things about that. Now, of course, that kind of, creates or constitutes a model through which some, another form of integrated or advanced external differentiation, similar perhaps to the EEA model, the European Economic Area model. But there also, I think, what we need to keep in mind to some extent is that Britain was very much a part of the making of these policies, to which it chose to be a part of or not to be a part of. So it had been in decision making for a very long time. So it doesn't come as a huge surprise to them when they're negotiating, certain parts of these policies or where they want to be integrated. And having said that, of course, moving on to the Turkish case, where we can say that, well, obviously there are areas where there can be immediate progress once the political deadlock between EU and Turkey were lifted. And of course, the customs union liberalization is one of those, and has already been mentioned. There is quite a lot of ground, that can be taken there, since the agreement itself is so outdated and things have changed so much since then. Of course, visa liberalization, it's something that's there on paper. It was progressing until it got to a certain article of the criminal code and it got blocked. So again, even these are not a done deal. They would require work, but at least it's important to show that there are ways to go. Now, of course, since you asked about, problems or extra challenges, now, of course, democracy and democratic backsliding is a major issue. But assuming that you are making steps to restoring democracy in Turkey, there are still significant governance issues. Rebuilding of institutions, remaking of institutional trust, societal legitimacy in institutions, independence of judiciary, etc., etc. There's quite a lot of ground to be taken in the political level for things to pick up. Now, on top of those, of course, then you would need to have a certain sense of economic recovery as well, that would accompany, or that would ideally accompany, the political reform. So economic governance, the economy as well, is an important area which we haven't mentioned, but which will, I think, in my opinion, be a challenge, not just for the EU-Turkey relationship, but for Turkey's governance in the future, in the near term. And of course, the migration issue. The migration issue, although it is an area of cooperation, contractually speaking, also between the EU and Turkey, I think this might be an issue that will also lead to a lot of further questioning and controversy in the future, as the anti-migrant sentiment in Turkey continues to rise, and there is more and more public debate and discussion what this agreement actually entails and implies for Turkey and Turkish society.
Okay, thank you very much. We can maybe talk about the agreement a bit further later on. Maybe in our last round of questions, we can turn to Andreas Nick again, and maybe we can look at it from a German perspective. Now we have a new government in Germany, and what kind of an effect would this new government have on Germany's relations within the EU? Because Germany had a kind of a leadership position within the EU. What kind of a relation we will see with this new government, and also how this new government's placement is going to affect Turkey-EU relations? What would be your thoughts on that?
I think it's fair to say that Germany, I think, of all EU countries, has the closest relationship and the closest level of integration with Turkish society. We have seen that, I think, in a number of situations. When I look at the 2020 crisis in the GNC, it was Germany almost to be the only one taking the role as a balancer, or trying to at least find a way of solving the issues with Turkey. And I think this is a reflection also of the fact that we are so interwoven as societies. There's more than 3 million people of Turkish origin who are integrated part of German society. And that comes, I think, with another consequence. Every political polarization and antagonization that we see within the Turkish society is immediately also part of our German domestic affairs. And in this regard, clearly, as we move probably into a period of further internal political tensions in Turkey, this is something to observe very closely in how it will play back also and reflected in Germany. As you asked for the new government, I would expect elements of continuity and elements of changed focus. I think especially within the Social Democrats, I think there would be a lot of continuity in terms of putting a high emphasis on our relationships with Turkey. If you look at the Liberals, and particularly at the Greens, they have a much closer focus and connection, I think, with certain parts of the opposition in Turkish society and politics. I think they will put a much higher emphasis on some of the human rights and democracy issues, and which is reflecting their their own electorate and the part of Turkish society in Germany was particularly interwoven. But I think everyone will very closely observe what is happening in this regard, and I'm a bit concerned that Turkish government may underestimate, I think, the importance of its behavior with regard to the European Court of Human Rights, most notably in the Kavala case, as an important context factor for these relations. We will, I think, in Germany always watch very closely what's happening in Turkish society, but every polarization, every conflict within Turkish society and democracy is also an immediate concern also to us domestically.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can give the floor to Senem Aydın-Düzgit for the last round, and maybe if you can add on what Andreas Nick has said, and maybe we can look at the situation also in Turkey. If there is a change of the government in Turkey in 2023, what kind of an effect would we be seeing in the near future for EU-Turkey relations?
Thank you, Pelin. Well, of course, I'll have to speculate there because we need to see what kind of a government is in place, how they are in place. Is it going to be coalition? Will they return straight to parliamentary system? So what's it going to look like? It's very hard to tell where we are today. But of course, assuming that if the opposition wins and assuming that they will stick to their campaign line and try to restore democracy and fundamental freedoms, this would, of course, immediately have a more, I would say, positive effect on the EU-Turkey relationship. It would at least open a space of dialogue which had been blocked for a long time now. So it could be possible, for instance, for the member states like Germany to give the mandate to the Commission for negotiating the customs union upgrade, or for instance, it could be perhaps possible for the new government to change the Turkish criminal code, the remaining articles at least, so that visa liberalization can be discussed and voted on in the council, etc. So there are things that can be done from that perspective. But having said that, there will also be some contentious issues, which in my opinion will remain contentious, even if the political constellations change. As I said, earlier on, I think migration and the continuation of the migration deal is one of those. This might be open to renegotiation. And then, of course, the opposition might want it to be renegotiated and somehow redesigned. So that might be a possibility. And of course, certain contentious issues between the two sides will not disappear overnight, such as Andreas Nick rightly pointed out, issues regarding with Cyprus, and also, of course, regarding the territorial water conflicts with Greece. So these are issues that will remain. But ultimately, these issues withstanding, we would have the potential to look into further cooperation or a more positive atmosphere of the relationship in the case that can happen.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank you very much, both Andreas Nick and Senem Aydın-Düzgit, for all your comments and your evaluations. And also, we would like to thank our viewers. Thank you all. See you next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.